Yeah, there's UFOs, psychedelics, lizard, shape-shifting reptilians from other dimensions.
All right. Welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. Harrison Cayley here with Elon Martin and Adam Daniels, joined again by Arthur Versluis, author of the new book, American Gnosis, Political Religion and Transcendence. Now, this book just came out recently. I had a bit of trouble getting it at first, but I've gotten a copy and I've started reading it. I haven't finished it yet, so we're definitely going to have Arthur back on to have a second, post-book discussion to make sure we don't miss any of the really juicy bits, because I'm just about 80 pages in so far, and I've read the previously published paper, Arthur, that you did that makes up part of 2 chapters later on in the book. So I've read a chunk of it. But hopefully we'll be able to maybe get a few spoilers as we talk about the stuff that I haven't read yet. So welcome to the show again, Arthur. Great to have you here.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. I enjoy our conversations, and particularly about this book, which is got some pretty wild stuff in it.
It does, and only 80 pages in, I've already found some wild stuff that I was like, oh wow, I can't believe that's in here. We talked a bit about this book on our last discussion, which was probably a year or so ago. So you'd been working on it, and you kind of gave us a little hint of what was to come, and now it's out there. And you'd mentioned in our previous talk the subject of this book, basically what you're calling neo-gnosticism. And maybe to give kind of a background, I know you give definitions and you make a bunch of different distinctions in the first chapter or two, the introduction. Maybe you could just kind of go over that for us a bit. What are the words you're using? So what is gnosis, and how are you categorizing neo-gnosticism?
Well, essentially, neo-gnosticism is a term to distinguish what the book is really about from the study of Gnosticism as a religious movement or a set of groups and figures and texts in the early Christian period. So you had multiple forms of Christianity in antiquity, and they're very interesting, and many of the texts were dug up out of a cave in 1945 and then later published and now are available on the web. Works like Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, and so on. And so that I do discuss a little bit Gnosticism in antiquity. And I talk about in the book how really what happened is the depictions of Gnosticism were largely determined by the church fathers, so-called, who hated it, hated the movements, ridiculed and detested it. And then later from a Jewish scholar by the name of Hans Jonas. And Hans Jonas in the 1930s, he wrote a book on Gnosticism that became, it helped shape how people understood it. And that form, what he put together, is actually what you see in neo-Gnosticism in our contemporary society. And that is, now that's not to say it's the same thing as ancient Gnosticism. It's not. What's in this book is all about modern themes. And those themes I call neo-Gnosticism because they hark directly back to this Hans Jonas set of themes, which include a false creator, kind of creator God who is deluded, who creates this kind of fallen, or is responsible for this fallen creation. Archons, these hostile entities that try to prevent spiritual progress. And a set of other themes, Sophia, the divine feminine, All of those are there in antiquity, but what happens is they recur in the modern period in literature, in film, in you see them in video games, you see them in memes. I show in the book. I have a collection of memes that's just incredible now, showing all these neo-Gnostic themes. Now, they're not Gnostic. People who are creating memes today, they're not saying, "Hey, I'm a Gnostic," right? Mm-hmm. They're not even really. They don't read the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, these ancient texts. All of what's happening, the people who created the Matrix aren't reading these. They said they're not reading. They weren't reading. This is not Gnostic. That's what they said. Now, what you see today is rather people drawing on these specific themes for different reasons, mainly because they help describe our world symbolically. So that, what I just talked about, is called cosmological Gnosticism. If you're in a cosmos that has hostile archons and it's a artificial creation, and you're seeking a way out of it, that is all cosmological, and that's mostly what we see in the book. It's still gnosis in the sense that it's escape. It is getting out, but it is not gnosis the way it was understood in terms of what I call metaphysical gnosis. Metaphysical gnosis is transcendence. It's literally the word meta, meta, beyond. So beyond metaphysics, beyond the physical, the transcendence. So gnosis, as I describe it and as it's usually now used really pretty broadly, it means transcendence. So that's the two twin themes of the book. On the one hand, these cosmological themes, and on the other hand, transcendence. So there is that a good explanation?
Yeah, that's a good launching off point, because one of the terms and characters and qualities that recurs throughout the book is this idea of Gnosticism or neo-Gnosticism without gnosis. So like you said, most of the book is about this cosmological gnosis. It's kind of a limited and specific form of gnosis. So it's you give examples like not necessarily in the neo-Gnostic sense, but if you look at different kind of Gnostic threads or streams, you have kind of a limited self-other transcendence. It might be in like sexual practices, like mystical sexual practices, or in a certain type of activity, maybe a magical activity, where they're kind of limited in space and time, whereas the kind of metaphysical gnosis is more of this all-encompassing mysticism of transcending all of that self-other duality. And so a lot of what we see in the neo-Gnostics is strictly limited to this other set of distinctions that you make, which is political gnosis. You add in there, so you have this range of gnoses from anti-gnosis to like political gnosis to cosmological to metaphysical, I believe. And so the political gnosis is kind of like, it's the red pill in the Matrix. It's waking up to this reality that the reality we're seeing isn't the reality we thought it was. That there's a hidden layer to reality. There are hidden like mysteries and secrets to be learned about reality. And so you can see this kind of progression, both in the book, I think, as it goes on, but also, in the book and through these various figures of the kinds of, it's almost like the kinds of limits that they're able to reach, or that they just present in their works. So some are just strictly limited to this political. It's like, oh well, this is the reality. We're led by these evil archons, which can take various forms, and that's kind of the end of it. And this, I noticed, or what stood out for me in these couple chapters that I've read is you look at, as you mentioned, popular culture and literary culture. So you look at the history of these themes in American literature and film and TV. And one of the things that you point out regarding the main neo-Gnostic movies, which you single out as like The Matrix, They Live, and Dark City, is that for the most part, there isn't really a lot of metaphysical kind of transcendent gnosis in there. So could you talk about a bit about that with kind of the movies as a launching point? So why is it, or if you don't know why, then maybe just comment a bit on these streams that you see and the seeming lack of metaphysical gnosis in these media. Like, what do you think's going on there?
Well, it's interesting because you don't see. You're right. You don't see what I'm terming metaphysical gnosis in really the bulk of the literature that I cover. And what I do is I actually, in the survey of literature, I decided to let other scholars demonstrate that these figures are all Gnostic. And so I cite, I'll cite, like, for example, William S. Burroughs. So I have a little section on Burroughs in there. And so it turns out there are 12 people who've written books and lengthy articles arguing that he's Gnostic. And so you can demonstrate that clearly there are these neo-Gnostic themes in Burroughs, right? It's hostile cosmos, these archontic type figures. He's searching for, in Western lands, he's searching for some kind of immortality, which he thinks is knowledge. All that is neo-Gnostic. At the same time, it doesn't seem like there's any transcendence really in there. It's this perpetual kind of realm of darkness, really. And you go through these authors, you can go back to the great pessimistic cynic Herman Melville, who he really liked and identified with the Gnostics, and he even wrote about them in poetry. But there's no transcendence in Melville. And in fact, what you see later in his life is the identification of, true knowledge in a kind of Schopenhauer way with just pessimistic sense of the cosmos as a trap. Why is that? Well, partly it's constitutional, right? He just didn't like Emerson. He didn't like he just didn't like them. And so, there's a constitutional aspect to this, but there's something else as well. I think historically what happened is mysticism, and I discuss this in a book called Platonic Mysticism. I have a chapter in there where I show that basically the word mysticism got more and more distorted in the last 100 years. And at this point, there's, very little precise use of even the term. And Gnosticism or Gnosis, focusing on Gnosis here, how many people really, can be characterized as emphasizing Gnosis in the sense of transcendent knowledge? Who represents that in our society? Basically, it's like a handful of people. So I think it's more a matter of a kind of social suppression, ultimately, of themes of Gnosis. I think that's a significant factor in all of it. But there are other reasons as well. So I think that's definitely one of them.
Well, maybe we can get into some of those other reasons, but on the topic of the constitution of these figures, reading that section in your book reminded me of something that William James had written about. I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but he talked about, I think, was it sick or sad souls versus happy souls or something like that. He made some kind of distinction between the two types of people, basically pessimists and optimists. He just had a different phrase for it, and it basically sounded like the exact dynamic that you were describing with the contrast between the pessimists like Melville, Hawthorne, and Poe, and then the kind of transcendentalists like Emerson, Whitman, and who were the other. There was one or two other of the kind of positive optimists in American literature, and I think the way that you put it is like a pessimist is going to look at one of these kind of happy optimists and just be like, just shake their head and be like, what's up with these guys? Like he doesn't have any idea how the world really works, right? And it probably is constitutional on a very basic level of just personality that it's you just have those, you have different types of people like with those different outlooks on life, and it seems like on the one hand the pessimists, like James argued that the pessimists seem to be that way because they see more of reality, because they see the darkness that the optimists don't see, and that it just makes sense to be depressed in a world where these bad things happen. On the other hand, there can be the tendency to go to the extremes, right? So the extreme pessimist can embody this worldview that you basically talk about, this world rejecting worldview without any hope, without anything higher, without any vision of any transcendence. And I think that's the thing that's the kind of common thread that I kind of see so far. It's almost like a complete nihilism. That this is the way the world is, and it's nothing more than that, and there's nothing possible more than that. So, in a sense, that's a very anti-Gnostic theme within like these neo-Gnostic currents, and you see that in a lot of the more recent literature that you talk about. Like, there's a ton of great authors in there, but that are more or less nihilistic, and you talk about Philip Dick, William Gibson. Who else off the top? Well, Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah.
Yep. Who's great. I mean, I think the first book of his that you read was mind blank. What's Blood Meridian?
Blood Meridian. Yeah.
Yeah. The first one I read was The Road, but then I went on to Blood Meridian. Great and dark book. But there are some who have hints of it, right? Maybe you can talk about some of the sources where there's at least the hint of transcendence, either in film or literature. Do any come to mind?
Yeah, that does exist. It's not the case that the entirety of American literature is pessimistic, and it's certainly not the case even that these authors necessarily are. In that, what you're seeing is a critique of not the world, it's so much as human society. Mm-hmm. So when you look at, what's evil in, Blood Meridian, what's evil in Cormac McCarthy's work generally, what is the source of evil in Thomas Pynchon? It's society. It's a screwed up society. So it's not necessarily the case that these people, throughout the book, the folks that I'm writing about are necessarily pessimistic in an ultimate sense, but they're highly critical of the society that they're seeing, or of fallen human nature, depending on the case. So McCarthy's a little more complicated, maybe because of the nature of his work and for a variety of reasons. But still, I mean, the neo-Gnostic themes people have identified those within his works. Thomas Pynchon does, I always thought of him as a total pessimist, really. A critic of the machine as a whole, machine society. And yet I found in my rereading of his work hints of, or at least potentially hints, maybe they're ruses, right? But the idea of a Pythagorean order or, Shambhala, secret kingdom, and those kinds of things are hinted at and kind of alluded to in a way that suggests that something else is possible. And I think that's an underlying theme of the whole book, really, in terms of many, many different subjects and authors I look at. Yes, there's an element of pessimism. For example, David Icke, can be regarded as pessimistic about society, right? But not necessarily about human nature. He's actually, emphasizing spiritual awakening and spiritual practices and so on. So it's not quite so simple as it's as simply pessimism or optimism. It's more recognizing that there's something wrong in society and it could be better, right? It doesn't have to be this way. That's what you see over and over. And that's what you also see in the films, right?
Mm-hmm. And one of the examples that you gave that I was very happy to see was was David Lynch in there, because these guys will joke and tell you that David Lynch is my favorite filmmaker, because I'm interested. David Lynch just as a character, as a person, interests me, and his work too, because, well, first of all, I don't like his paintings, right? I don't like his actual art because it's just so dark and disturbing, like even more than his films, and I just don't like looking at it. But even practically all of his films, all of his work is extremely dark. It's about like the most basic forms of evil and intricate forms of evil. And yet, and even Twin Peaks, which you talk about, the entire series, I mean, finishing watching that third season that just came out a few years ago, it leaves you with a bad feeling, right? Like it's up in the air. You're not sure what happened, and it's just there's a feeling of just something's off. That's the only way I can describe it right now. And yet you look at David Lynch himself, and of course he's an advocate of transcendental meditation, and he's kind of in that sense the happiest, like most fun person to be around by all accounts of the people around him. He's just a total gentleman. He's got that funny voice, and he's always polite, and he doesn't swear often, and he's all about transcendence. And you're hearing him talk about meditation. You would not expect him to make the art that he does. So the way I've always interpreted his art is that it's kind of an initiation into the total depths of human and non-human depravity and the reality of what exists in the world as a kind of contrast. But there's contrast to the good, but there's always kind of a sliver and a possibility of that can be transcended, and that there is a transcendence that kind of beyond that. Do you have kind of similar thoughts on Lynch, and how do you see those kind of themes fitting into this, and especially just Lynch himself? Like, what do you think of him and his strangeness?
Well, I've been interested in his work for a long time, and have seen maybe not everything, but pretty close to everything, including that entire season that was released after a period of many years of Twin Peaks. I watched the whole thing, and he's consciously invoking all kinds of things in there in terms of 1920s, 1930s films, and previous, all kinds of gestures in there, or direct allusion, really allusions. And then often what he's doing is consciously breaking down the way you see a character. So he's making a character you have to separate yourself from the character, because the character is literally separated from the character, right? So there's a conscious disconnect that happens in Twin Peaks. Now, what is really that about? is that transcendence? Well, yeah, it doesn't. It's not. I wouldn't describe it that way. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of light in his work. That's absolutely true. Does he fit into or resonate with these neo-Gnostic themes? Oh yeah. I mean, just imagine yourself in a Lynch world, right? I mean, one of these worlds, just
No, thank you.
project yourself in there. Well, it's like we're living in a neo-Gnostic world already. And this is like this is like what was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche said of LSD. It's super samsara, right? Like you go on LSD, that's super samsara. Well, that's kind of what Lynch gives you is super samsara. And so, is there transcendence? I'm not seeing it. Not in his work.
Yeah, I would argue that Blue Velvet might have given us a taste of transcendence. I mean, the protagonist by the end of the hero's journey is able to restore as much of Dorothy, Isabella Rossellini's life as possible. He gets the girl at the end. The villains are all apprehended or killed. But on the whole, I would agree, because so many of his films leave the protagonists kind of stuck in the morass or the maze or the labyrinth of the evil influences that they're surrounded by. And you get the flavor of the metaphysical. It kind of permeates the whole thing. But on the whole, I would have to agree. But I did just want to say that we got a little bit of light at the end of Blue Velvet, which is admittedly one of his darkest and best works. I did want to ask you, Arthur, about so you have this chapter, which is one of the first ones that I read, and one of the few. I'd like to get to the rest of the book, but it's called American Archontic Neo-Gnosticism. And in it, you focus mainly on the kind of the political ideas that are most often familiar with the right in the U.S. and in Western civilization, South America perhaps as well, that allude to or watered down versions of some kind of understanding on an intuitive level, it seems to me, of this kind of light versus dark conflict that we're seeing in the West today. And it made me think a little bit of Paul Schrader, the screenwriter, would discuss transcendental film, and he would make reference to guys like Luc Besson and these kind of very obscure movies that were nonetheless, filled with these dark protagonists who always managed to find the light at the end of the tunnel. And Schrader's point, alluding to Bresson, was that even though these intense kind of morose, unenjoyable, obscure art house films had this concentrated cinematic representation of light versus dark, in the way that maybe a Dostoevsky novel would have, that there were versions of it that were watered down and propagated throughout society and pop culture, as you allude to in the earlier chapters, which, even though they weren't quite the full feast of a discussion on Gnosticism, they still gave enough of a flavor, of a taste, of a hint, of an on-ramp for many people. And I was wondering, given the intensity of the times that we're living in right now, given the kind of life and death flavor of the experience of living in this time and place. How much of an on-ramp, if you will, might you say, the memes, the kind of American archontic neo-gnosticism memes that we're seeing and ideas, how much of a strength might they and potential have for people to achieve? And I realize this sounds a little out there, and even a metaphysical understanding of Gnosticism, where it's powerful, or more powerful than we might otherwise assume on the surface of it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things I would say is that I didn't really in starting out on the book, and for some period, I had a completely different outline in mind, and I had a completely different book really in mind. So I didn't really expect to discover everything that I discovered, because I didn't know until I discovered it that this is what I was going to find. And so that's true of authors in the book. There are some authors in the book that have never been published. There's literally nothing published. So you look at the work of Charles Musès. This is the only place where everything by Musès is suddenly there, right? And so, because I went through everything. Now, I didn't really know that stuff was out there until I discovered it, and started to really expand my range of knowledge. Now, when it comes to the realm of memes and the dissident right, which is really where I would say the overwhelming majority of the neo-Gnostic memes in the book, I could find essentially almost none on the left, very, very few. It's almost always dissident right memes. Well, why, right? Why? Because you look at how things actually are in American society, and if the head of the FBI is saying that these are the folks that we need to target, then from their perspective, Gnosticism is a very natural way of expressing yourself, because you're trapped in a hostile cosmos. From the point of view of the right, the total domination of the left in society de facto makes it a hostile cosmos. And so what I do in the book is then develop not only this, but this set of, discussion of memes, and the sense that people on the right are in general feeling that they're living in a hostile society and an artificial society, artificially constructed, but also the idea that there's a spectrum. That led me to realize that there is a spectrum of gnosis, right? It's not just one thing and you define it and then you're good. And it either is, this is it, or it is, or it isn't. There's political gnosis, right? Which is waking up to the sense that something is awry in the world. And you see that in all these films where Neo is presented with with the pills, right? Famously presented with the pills. And you can take the red pill, or you can take the blue pill, and then it became the white pill and the black pill. There's all these pills, right, that are now available out there in culture, as it were, or in society. The idea, and those pills, in quotes, are knowledge. But there's different levels of knowledge, because I started to see also in the same circles, there's now political gnosis, meaning waking up to the nature of the system. But then that intersects with and overlaps with people who emphasize spiritual dimensions. They're not opposed to the political dimensions. They recognize it, but then they're open to spiritual thing, spiritual understood in a very broad sense. So it could include, I mentioned in there a group on Gab, 5D Star Seeds. It's got this long title, right? Well, that title, that group and people posting in it have said some very Gnostic things that are very much aligned with political gnosis, but then bleed over into spiritual, right? And so there's kind of a spectrum. The people who are metaphysical, I define as or characterize as metaphysical gnosis that represent that, really have nothing to do with the political gnosis. So in that sense, there seems to be a gap. There's like a spectrum, and then this other group that is simply not concerned with the political so much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, there was a great word, I think it was on one of the, right at the beginning of the book for that kind of merger of spirituality and the political element, conspirituality, which I thought was hilarious. I'd never heard that one before. I can't remember if you came up with that one or if someone else did. No, you found that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Great.
There are people who specialize in conspirituality, which is, like conspiracy spirituality. Yeah. It's a word like Brangelina or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a portmanteau.
Mm-hmm. So what? Okay, so you've described why it is that these neo-Gnostic themes seem to be more prevalent on the right, at least at this time. I just want to put together a few random thoughts. So one that kind of just stood out a bit was in relation to the development of the neo-Gnostic memes and images, like the red pill. And you give an example that took place on Twitter with, was it Donald Trump Jr.? I think that basically tweeted something about taking the red pill, and then, or correct me, who were the two figures? Was it Trump Jr. and Ivanka?
Yeah, I think it was her actually. But yeah, it spread as these things often do, right?
Mm-hmm. And then one of the Wachowskis replied back saying basically "F both of you" or something. And so you see that the sources of a lot of the neo-Gnostic stuff, it seems, have come from people on the political left of the spectrum, like the Wachowskis. Well, probably a lot of the artists and a lot of the creative types creative types tend to be more on the left side of the political spectrum. So it's just kind of to be expected. So, but it's kind of strange. It's a weird symptom of our kind of political climate that those polarizations and those divisions even crop up in these terminologies. Oh, and it was the same with "they live." You gave an example of was it Carpenter, right, who wrote and directed it, and he was saying he was having none of "they live" being used in the current climate to describe what's going on. And of course, the meme in "they live" is the glasses, the magical glasses that show you the reality behind the surface reality. And he was saying, no, this was about Reaganism. I hated the capitalists and the yuppies. That's what this movie was about. And it's like, and that's all it's allowed to be about. But this ties into this notion that you have of these kind of intellectual ideational bricks that make up a something, like in this case Gnosticism, how there doesn't have to be a direct line of transmission from, let's say, the ancient Gnostics to any other particular group that may have Gnostic themes, whether you're looking in history and you're looking at like the Cathars and the Bogomils, or in these modern day neo-Gnostics. There doesn't need to be a line of transmission, because like you said, with the political, like with the dissident right, when you're living in a situation that you can interpret in such a way, and that seems to be like for you is that reality, these bricks come naturally. These ideas come naturally because they fit. And in a sense, you could say they come naturally because they might actually be reality in some sense. So you've got kind of like, as opposed to like to use a biological example, evolution, that, you've got traits that carry on through specific lines, or you might have what they call like convergent evolution, where things happen at different times, totally unrelated to each other, just because they're, approaching the same endpoints or matching to certain conditions. And kind of the last random point to throw in here, I think I mentioned this the last time that we talked, is I should have looked up the book, but there's this book on Gnosticism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I can't remember the title or the author. I'll have to put it in the show description. But it was this guy's argument that that those two bodies of work kind of represented similar social conditions, and that from his perspective, apocalypticism, I think, was the main theme. The apocalypticism found in both in texts from both of these sources, that apocalypticism, and he traced back the antecedents into like the Egyptian sources and Egyptian magical papyri and things like that. He was arguing that the political situation seemed to be what dictated the arising of these types of worldviews. And that's for him, that seemed to be the main thing, is that when, for instance, under foreign occupation, it would be it was natural to think that something has gone wrong on the metaphysical scale, in the higher worlds, because the God that was in, like, God in the world and everything was not right. There was something out of whack. God should be in charge. Our God should be in charge. And we have this like foreign invader. That must mean either that our God has, failed or done something, or this other God was stronger. But there was this political situation which was seen as being ruled by foreign bad rulers, had this effect on the spiritual thinking and the spiritual writing of these people. And so it seems to me that like the question this is all kind of leading up to, I think, is that, and it might just be, the answer might just be what you already said about, for instance, on people on the right seeing this as kind of an archontic, reality. But what is it about reality, about this current times, that leads to these themes either experiencing a resurgence or just making them so readily available? Is it strictly a matter of just politics that's been going on for the last 5-10 years? Is there more to it? Like how do you see this in kind of like the bigger picture or the big picture?
Well, that's a great question, because the book is constructed to go through different areas. So you look at literature, you look at films like They Live, this idea that, this guy, this former pro wrestler who's an itinerant worker, in reality, he's a pro wrestler. He goes out and he finds these glasses, and when you put the glasses on, you can see reality. Okay, you can see through the false world of the ads, and you see that we're actually under this kind of metaphysical occupation, right? That there's this this kind of cosmic, I shouldn't say I should say this cosmic occupation of aliens, right? They're these skull-looking aliens, and so that are all really running things. And so those memes that come from that, I've seen two sets of memes. One, the glasses. Okay, so you have the glasses on. You see in the meme, first the glasses are off, and you see some message, that's out there. Typically an ideological message of some sort. And then he puts the glasses on, and then the message is suddenly transformed to what it really means, right? Which is construed as anti-white or something, right? So what you're seeing there is natural confluence between those images, or the images of the skull-faced alien sort of beings, or lizards. I saw some great memes yesterday, in fact, on lizard people, showing lizard people, very well constructed memes of lizard people. Now, that's a whole rabbit hole to go down in itself, should we want to go in that direction. But the question you're asking is, what is the larger significance of all of this, right? And I think there's two ways to think about it. One is an expression that something from the point of view of the authors and the filmmakers and the people who are drawing on them for the memes, is that something is awry in society. Society itself has gone awry. It's gone astray. And implicit in that is we need to fix it, right? So that's one kind of meta. Now, that's true of certainly of Pynchon. It's true of, many of these authors and many of the films, really. That's what, and basically all of the memes, that's what they're saying. That is one way of understanding it. And I think it's totally legitimate way of understanding it. In other words, from the point of view of somebody who creates a meme about the White House being occupied by Archons, well, it's not necessarily that there are actually literally lizards in the White House, but from the point of view of somebody on the dissident right, it's seen as occupied. Now, you could imagine a Christian nationalist, let's say that, let's just, as an imagination practice, you could say, kind of imagination experiment, you could say, all right, so Christian nationalism has taken over the country. You could imagine Gnostic memes from the left, right? Just reverse the situation. You could see totally Archons. Who are the Archons? It's the Christian nationalists. And not only that, but you look at the work by Stephen Wolfe on Christian nationalism, and what does he say? Well, we might have to burn some heretics, right? I mean, go read the book. He's citing a bunch of Reformed theologians about how you might have to kill some heretics. I mean, it's regrettable, but, sometimes you got to kill heretics, right? So from the point of view of the left, under that circumstance, totally I can see Gnostic memes, right? That's a thought experiment. Now, stepping back further, for almost all of these figures we're talking about, it's not that the world, that nature, that the cosmos is cracked somehow or fallen or broken, but there is that view. And Musace discusses it. He discusses the idea that the cosmos itself is, there was a kind of cosmic rupture, and that's what created our parasitic and destructive society that we're living in, because nature itself has parasites. Why does it have parasites? Why does it have, this destructive cycle, violence and bloodshed and so on? Well, he goes back to Gnostic and then Mandaean. He refers at length to a Mandaean text and some other sources in order to make his argument that there's something really actually that went awry in the cosmos itself. So not everybody, is necessarily on this society only path, you could say, but Musace is kind of an outlier. He's such an extraordinary guy. He's like he came from another planet or another dimension or something. As you read his work, you read his work and it's just so, it's not just read, listen to it. I mean, he created a whole scale of music. He created he discovered this thing he called hypernumbers, which is a number theory. He discovered this. He actually created music based on a on a different musical system than what we're used to, because you don't have to use the musical scale that we take for granted generally. You can actually use others. He used others for initiatic purposes. So he's like somebody from another, I don't know. But he's not alone. So I think there's two answers to your question, and it just depends how far back you want to pull, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that seems to be almost I'd say that's the way reality is designed, that that there are always further layers, and that people can stop at a certain layer, and maybe they're fine with that layer, and maybe they're prevented from in some way, whether from some internal or external source, from progressing any further. But there's always new barriers to break down or new veils to lift. And that seems to be, and new heights to rise to and develop to. And I think that's kind of what the spirituality element of that we find in conspirituality, or in religion or spirituality in general, or mysticism is there are constantly like higher levels of reality or new levels of awareness to kind of break through to and to transcend, maybe.
Well, I wanted to follow up on all of that, Harrison, because the sense I'm getting is that all of these hints of Gnosticism through neo-Gnosticism, for instance, and all of these pop culture references and this political red pilling and all of that, it would seem to me, and I'm wondering what you think about this, Arthur, is because in metaphysical Gnosticism, you explain that there is this kind of breaking down of the knower and the known, a connection to the divine. And it was very interesting to me that in the election of 2020, you had these very middle of the road Christians going to churches and praying for Trump's success, like heartily, like they were almost compelled, or they knew on some level that this was or thought on some level that this was a spiritual battle that they were engaged in via the political battle. And so my question is, do you ever get the sense that there is this resurgence of Gnosticism, however neo-Gnostic a form it's taken, precisely because there is some influence from an objectively existent divine energy or force? Yes, that there is this imbuing of understanding of energy that is meant to counter all of this darkness that we've been witnessing in the social and political and cultural spheres in the past however many years.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because it all depends on who you're looking at and who you're discussing in terms of the book. But from the point of view of many of the political people that I'm citing or drawing on, ultimately they're envisioning something better. They're envisioning a different world. And some of those folks I demonstrate are explicitly emphasizing, and I mention in particular light workers, people who see the world as a battle between light and dark, and illumination is taking place. And from that perspective, and this is exactly opposite, of course, the perspective that you've seen recently, but the idea that as this woman who's a light worker that I discuss in the book said, I asked her directly about that, and she said, President Trump, it isn't that he sees himself this way or that he is perfect. It's just that he's acting as an instrument of light. And he is on the side of light. That's what she said. That's her perception. Now, when you get to figures like I mentioned at the end of the book, Joel Morwood, who kind of followed in the footsteps of Franklin Merrill Wolff, who was a kind of yogi figure in the mountains of California, and had a ranch in the mountains. He lived to about 100, and late in life, Joel Morwood came and showed up at his door, and Morwood had this spiritual awakening experience. Now, the experience that he had and that Franklin Merrill Wolff had is very closely aligned with, although maybe not identical with, what is visible in Buddhism. It's not saying they're Buddhists, but they themselves draw on Buddhism. There, you don't find this kind of discussion of politics and the darkness of society and so on very much at all. Little bit, because Morwood did go to China. He went to China thinking that it was going to be great, and it was the future, actually. That's what he thought at that time under Mao. And what he discovered was that he was being shown a Potemkin village, and that actually was, it was not so great. And so there is, even in Morwood, a little bit of this. So I'm saying is there's a spectrum, but there is a kind of break-off point where people who are emphasizing strictly illumination are not so much engaged in the political. Mm-hmm. I think that is what you broadly see. Maybe not 100%. I'm not going to say 100%, because when you go to Stephen Huller, who's a contemporary Gnostic, head of a Gnostic church in California, almost all of the themes in the entire book appear in his written work. So it's all the way through. So all the way through the book. So it's not the case that you can just make these firm distinctions. So what I'm doing is giving you kind of like a broad, a broad swath of what's going on in the book.
Well, you mentioned Huller. I haven't read him, but after you mentioned a book of his last time we talked, so I've got it. I just haven't read it yet. But Huller, he came. What country did he come from originally? Was it? Do you remember? It was an Eastern European country, right?
Yeah, he was behind the Iron Curtain when he was young. So he came to America specifically because of freedom. And he wrote a whole book about the alchemy of freedom, right. Spiritual alchemy of freedom. So he's very explicit. And he, in many ways, I discuss him at the end of the book because he does bring together all of these themes in such a elegant way. And he's a very distinctive American figure, actually, maybe even I would say unique for a variety of reasons. And he had seen communism firsthand, as actually Morwood had, and he didn't want any part of it. That was true also, by the way, of Musace, who said that communism is, he said it's like a nature, it's like a fungus or a parasite. It's ultimately only destructive in its contemporary form.
And sorry, the name of that guy, was it Moorhead that you just mentioned?
Morwood, Joel Morwood. Yeah.
So given his background, did he kind of just stop talking about any kind of political dimension and move into this totally kind of spiritual
yes
view? Okay, because I was that kind of makes me. I've got a few questions in my mind about this kind of division, how you have the kind of the mystic transcendentalists, Gnostics, who kind of don't seem totally cut off, or to seem to totally isolate themselves from the political discourse. You've got a guy like Huller, who kind of seems to straddle both, if I'm hearing correctly. And I'm wondering if this has something to do with a phenomenon that Lobachevsky talks about. And you cite, I was happy to see you cite political ponerology in there. It's very nice. But Lobachevsky, basically, one of the themes of ponerology and on the topic of pathocracy, which is Lobachevsky's word for essentially what we think of as communism in the 20th century, the communist system, is that, like, for the people living under it, the people who had the most kind of the closest experience to it, the most intimate experience with it, living under it their entire lives, some often being born into it and living their entire lives there, is that it's an experience that can't really be transmitted to someone who hasn't experienced it. Kind of like gnosis, perhaps, but a strange kind of gnosis. It's not that, it doesn't feel very good. So you've got this scenario, this phenomenon where you've got Eastern Europeans who might come over to the United States, move here, and the way Lobachevsky describes it, and the way a bunch of the people that I cited in the notes, like fellow Polish people, other people from China or Eastern Europe, they describe coming to the United States and basically not being able to talk to anyone because no one understands. They try to have a conversation with a normal American, and they just there's no common ground for them to transfer, to communicate what their experience was. And also with the people or the way that Lobachevsky describes it, and the way that Rod Dreher kind of describes it in his book "Live Not by Lies," about the kind of underground Christian movement in these Eastern European countries, is that the spiritual and the political were kind of like side by side. Like you couldn't have one without the other, because they were both like tangible realities for people. So there was the constant political pressure that could be felt everywhere, and there was this spirituality that grew and developed within that crucible. I think that's the word that Lobachevsky even uses. That this was a crucible in which new ideas, new or old reappropriated or re-energized values kind of took shape and took hold of people. So I'm wondering if how much of the division is a what's the word, like a lack of compatibility between the two, and how much of the division might be a product of circumstances that maybe in 10 or 20 years of political totalitarianism, maybe the picture might be different, and maybe the Gnostics and the spiritual transcendentalists might have they might be writing different books and giving some slightly different teachings, or at least including some material that they wouldn't otherwise at this point in time. I'm wondering what you think about all that. Do you think it's like a difference in kind of realms, like the worldly and the spiritual, that just on some level don't mix, or should there be some mixture, or is it strictly a product of the worldly situation in Eastern Europe? Why you sometimes see those themes put together, like in the work of Huller?
Well, that's a great question, because in contemporary society, and this is something that I had to confront in writing the book, is that broadly speaking, it's very difficult for people to see today, to see the perspective of someone from the other political side. So, for example, people who are on the dissident right, the idea seems to be that, as Hillary Clinton famously said, these are the deplorables. In other words, One can only deplore everything about them, and they have no valid points whatsoever. Nothing that they say is valid. Now, in writing the book and in working with the material, my approach is empathy. In other words, I'm empathetic to whomever I'm writing about, whether it's Gnostics or whomever, in the sense of trying to understand. Now, from the point of view of these folks, and I'll give an example. I tell the story in here of Josh Neal, and Josh Neal wrote a book called American Extremist. It's kind of his autobiography, and he's on the dissident right. Well, who is he citing? Well, he's citing political ponerology, because from his point of view, that book exactly conformed to his understanding of the world. And his own worldview was very much aligned with what would be in Eastern Europe if you were, for example, Czesław Miłosz. You're Czesław Miłosz behind the Iron Curtain, under communism, looking at the communist system, and spirituality is itself part of your critique of that system. Now, when you go to Josh Neal, now for a lot of people, this is going to be very mind bending, right? Because it forces you, once you grapple with this, you're compelled to recognize, and this is totally just objectively true, you're compelled to recognize that this contiguity between these figures is real, whether you like it or not. In other words, Josh Neal is actually citing political ponerology and seeing his own. He tells his story in the book as somebody on the right, but he's also analyzing society, contemporary American society. And what he sees is that it's effectively very much akin to what you saw in communism. Contemporary 2020 society or 2018 society is already very similar to what you saw in Eastern Europe in the situation of somebody like Miłosz or Lobachevsky, right? That the dissident is also spiritually a dissident, and he describes his political awakening as a spiritual awakening. So to think about these things in this way compels a kind of mind change, you could say. It compels you to see things in a way that maybe you've never confronted before. And that's really interesting, because that's kind of what Gnosticism did back in the day also. Just saying. That is, back in antiquity, it also compelled shifts in understanding and perspective. So that's what I would say.
Maybe it's this crucible that we're seeing now here that is compelling individuals to ask the right questions and move towards a greater spiritual understanding as an answer to the pressures that they're feeling when they know on some level that things are just not going the way they might otherwise under more normal circumstances, under a healthier system. So in one sense, it may not be that, getting back to an earlier point I was alluding to, that there is this an extension of knowledge and gnosis and assistance and help, or maybe there is to some degree, but there's also individuals feeling this heat, for lack of a better term, this distress that is pushing them, that is compelling them to go towards understanding what it is that's making them feel this way. And it could probably take many different forms. And, it's interesting to me that Norman Finkelstein he considers himself an atheist. And yet he's a profound truth teller, and providing answers and knowledge in his sphere of political history and influence. But still others might, you have the Archbishop Vigano, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is very political and understands the political in spiritual terms and is able to frame things in that sense. So, yeah, I guess that goes back to what you were saying a little earlier about this, it's really very complicated in some ways. And there is a spectrum. And I guess according to one's constitution and knowledge and propensities, a response to what we're seeing unfold is going to come out in very different ways.
I think it was really interesting how you've got the, at least from the little bit, that I've gotten through of the work so far, how from everything that, that you have written, and everything that you've said, this Gnostic ideas exist not because of some theoretical thing that would have to exist, because this is what we say is going on, but there seems to be this mapping of reality, and that is where all of this mapping from the American dissident right, who are drawing on these different ideas, and it's mapping to this more ancient Gnostic framework that they aren't aware of, or maybe they aren't aware of. They're mapping it onto something that they're seeing, because that's actually what's really going on. And, regardless of whether or not, they realize everything as being, Gnostic or whatever, that's all kind of irrelevant. It's all just really fascinatingly interesting how, without any formal, exposure to these Gnostic thinkers and writers, they still are able to pick up and draw on the ideas behind them, because it's very real. You can feel the spiritual angst from what's going on with the political pressures, like you're talking about, Alon. The pressures in the political sphere, it leads you in two directions, because when your society isn't functioning correctly, well, obviously you can look at that purely from the political standpoint and realize, well, I mean, we could probably do a little bit better than what we're seeing right now, right? I think we could probably, not be as mean to each other or as stupid. And that's just from the political sphere. And so the pressures drive you to think in these kinds of ways. It's like, okay, well, there's people who are like pushing for this, that, or whatever. But then also from the spiritual side of it, it's because you don't want to just build, I guess you would say, for certain people, they have a different fundamental makeup. And so when they have these kinds of political pressures, they've got also a drive or a desire to transcend it metaphysically, like you had talked about before, where there's this inner desire to transcend one's own suffering and one's own limitations in a spiritual sense. And I think this kind of gets into what Harrison was talking about how there seems to be this, like you said, this divide between the spiritual and the political, and how that can be in some sense like fundamental to a personal makeup, where some people focus more on the political, others might focus more on the spiritual. But sometimes, every so often, the two meet and someone realizes that, hey, I can both work on myself and try to help better the world around me. And how you're able to tease these ideas out about how American thinkers, filmmakers, writers, etc., are able to pull and tease out all of these seemingly fundamental truths about the nature of our reality is really quite it's quite something. It's pretty interesting. So would you have like anything more to add in terms of like what Harrison was talking about being about this amount, or maybe it was you, Alon, talking about there being an emerging of these two, and if that is a way forward for American society?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, at the very beginning of what you said, you were referring to how these themes like Archons or Demiurge or Sophia or these other different aspects of building blocks of neo-Gnosticism keep recurring. Well, I wanted to mention that when you look at something like the virtual reality that meta unquote is trying to create, right? That Zuckerberg has decreed that there shall be vast amounts of money being dumped into this program to create an artificial realm. And he said in an interview that he saw himself as akin to the divinity in the Old Testament, creating a new world. And really, it doesn't take a lot to see that is kind of demiurgic. It's really not hard to see that. You don't need to see the gospel. You don't need to go back to the Gospel of Philip to see that that's literally creating an artificial world, right? And what is the point of that world? What is the purpose, right? And that's something nobody has really been able to explain, but or enunciate, other than it's a point of sale, something, virtual real estate. I don't know, but is that kind of artificial environment going to be policed? Undoubtedly, right? I mean, you can't have your meta virtual reality just kind of a Wild West, right? So it's got to have some archons, got to have some structure in there, right? So these ideas are so implicit, they're so inherent in the structure of the world that we find the society we find ourselves in, or many aspects of it, that it's no surprise that people rediscover or reuse these terms, because they describe it so well, right? So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is many of the people that I draw on in the book, a number of them at least, are referring to creating a new earth, a new world, or creating a new way of being in the world. And maybe the way they're expressing it is different than what someone else may express it as, but a new earth. Somebody in a post said, online post said, it's designed to bring you forth to higher consciousness, higher frequency light. We're clearing out the old and bringing in the new earth collectively and personally. Well, that's a kind of energy that is out there, right? There are alternative communities that are being developed, and they're not in the news because why would it be in the news, right? It's not something that would be in the news because it's just, quote, not newsworthy, unquote, to these people who are creating these different, communities hither and yon. There's an entire movement in Russia, Anastasia movement. Who's heard of that? Well, not so many people, because it doesn't make, quote, news, unquote, right? But these things are happening. So I would say that there are some very interesting things emerging. Some of them are visible in Morewood. Some of them are visible in, these other figures that I mentioned. But then there's a whole section of the book that we haven't gotten to, and we can get to at some point, perhaps, that is about the future. So that's something we're also exploring at Hyros Institute. So
So we'll save that for another time then.
No, we should get into it.
We should jump in.
Well, yeah, let's get a preview of that, because, like I said, I want to definitely have you back on again to once we've finished reading the book. I'm sure we'll have many more kind of branches of ideas that we can go off on. But yeah, give us a hint of that, a hint of that future. Yeah. So what's going on in that chapter?
Well, it's actually the latter part of the book is discussing things, including what I call future gnosis. And so that's in the book. It's also a set of themes that on Hyros Institute we're going to be looking at. We've done a little bit of that. I had a conversation with Kingsley Dennis the other day, and that's on there. But there's so many different aspects to this. There's so much in this book and so much to talk about that I don't want to, but just very briefly, there's a section that discusses cycles, historical cycles, and different theories of history. And then there's a section that discusses future gnosis and different possibilities in the future. And that's a theme that really occupies my attention right now. I have to say, I find this book so exciting. It was so exciting to discover and explore these different areas, and to have everything converge where it comes out as an Oxford book just gives me a lot of pleasure for a whole variety of reasons. So, it's been enormously entertaining to discuss these different things, and rewarding. So, I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss them with you. You guys are really thoughtful and interesting conversationalists, and I enjoy it. So, and I enjoyed writing the book, and I've enjoyed seeing it go out into the world and spread its subversive ideas that are undoubtedly embedded in there in all sorts of ways. So, it's been a great pleasure.
Well, I'll just say that one thing I wasn't expecting to find, but that just made me smile, was I was not expecting to find a reference to Antarctic Nazi UFOs. But it's somewhere in here in the
it's in there.
Miguel
Serrano. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So that was great.
There's so much exotic stuff in there. And it has all these ramifications. So, things are crowding at my mind to share. Some of them are not in the book, but I discovered them, just kind of in happenstance. So like, and you never can see it again. You see this thing again the same way, so it's just, there's tons of stuff like that. Yeah, there's UFOs, psychedelics, lizard, shape-shifting reptilians from other dimensions, all the sorts of usual things you would expect.
Mm-hmm. Yep, in an OUP, Oxford University Press book. Absolutely. Well, I'm sure. Well, that's been a question that I guess we'll wrap up pretty quick, but just kind of a side question. I've been wondering, because I know there are a few scholars here and there working in the academy who look at weird stuff that isn't usually discussed, in your average university class. And of course, you cite a ton of sources in this book, including a ton of maybe not as many primary sources, but you cite some secondary sources. Like I know I mentioned
a lot of primary. There's almost 1,000 endnotes, endnotes, and they're almost all primary sources.
Right. So just how do you see the academic study of these kind of fringe things? Like, is there anyone else doing the kinds of things you do in different areas, maybe like different figures, maybe, or do you kind of see yourself as going into these kind of wholly uncharted territories?
This book is uncharted territory. Yeah. There is April DeConnick did a book several years ago. She discusses Gnosticism in contemporary society, and Diana Pasulka has done
Yes.
some interesting work on UFOs. And we actually sat down and had some very interesting chats when she was here, some time ago. So there are a few of us out there, but not a great many. And there's stuff in this book that's just wild. So, I hope people have a chance to explore it. I'm seeing, and I have to give you a warning. My MacBook Air has been acting up, and it is now giving me a low battery warning, which is somewhat alarming in the way it is showing up. So I'm passing that along.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up for today. We'll have you back on again soon. So hope maybe in January, if that's cool with you, because I'll finish reading this book, or I'm sure we'll finish it pretty quickly, and then we'll just give the holidays, and then hopefully just come right back into it, because like you said, there's so much more that we can discuss, and you've dropped some hints. I'm interested in the stuff that's not in the book too, so maybe we'll ask you about that. But with that said, again, the book is American Gnosis. We'll have links in the description, as well to Arthur's websites. Anything else to say, Arthur? Anything else that you want people to hear?
I would say thank you. Thank you. It's been a great conversation, and next time we can talk about the future.
All right. And the lizard people.
Yeah. Absolutely. And many other things, alchemy too. So.
Yes, great. All right, thanks, Arthur.
Thank you.